Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Faith Based Initiatives to Address Extreme Heat Sessions issues session. My name is Karen Bigelow, and I'm a co executive director of Creation Justice Ministries, where our mission is to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. During this session, we will have an engaging webinar on nurturing resilience and fostering community strength in the context of extreme heat events. As temperatures rise and the frequency of heat waves intensifies, it is crucial to come together to explore effective strategies for mitigating the impacts of extreme heat, especially on populations susceptible to heat related illnesses. Our expert panel today will discuss the disproportionate effects of extreme heat on marginalized communities, particularly focusing on the experiences of communities of color. By examining the root causes of these disparities, we aim to create awareness and advocate for equitable solutions. We will also explore practical approaches to building resilience and protecting communities during extreme heat events, from establishing cooling stations and providing access to safe drinking water to implementing heat response plans. Our panelists will share invaluable insights and best practices for churches and community members to take. Now, I will introduce our expert panel for this session. First, I'm going to start off today with Christian Brooks, who is a dedicated racial, gender, and environmental justice leader with a profound commitment to promoting equity and driving transformative change in the public sector. With over 9 years of experience, Christian Brooks has been at the forefront of advocating for social justice causes, seeking to create a more just and equitable world. Christian recently spearheaded the climate and environmental policy advocacy at the Office of Public Witness for the Presbyterian Church USA. In this role, she delved into the intersections between climate and environmental justice and critical topics, including Black maternal health, reproductive justice, and the racial wealth divide, as well as reparations. Driven by a vision for a society that safeguards civil and human rights and prioritizes race and gender equity, Christian is dedicated to pushing for progressive federal legislation that fosters inclusive policies. In January 2023, Christian took her commitment to the next level and founded Christian and Brooks LLC, a climate and environmental justice consulting firm. This innovative venture aims to uplift race and gender equity within the climate and environmental sectors, working tirelessly to make a lasting impact on the world. Beyond her advocacy and consulting work, Christian Brooks also owns and operates Brooks Bookkeeping and Accounting Services, a venture designed to empower and educate women of color on matters related to taxes and business finances. Through bookkeeping services, tax planning and preparation, and financial education, Christian Brooks is empowering women to take control of their financial destinies and achieve economic independence. Christian's impressive educational background speaks to her dedication to continuous learning and personal growth. She holds a Bachelor's of Science in Accounting from the University of Pittsburgh, a Master of Divinity from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and a Master of Science in Public Policy and Management from Carnegie Mellon University. These diverse education achievements serve as the foundation for her multifaceted approach to affecting positive change in society. With an unwavering commitment to social justice and environmental preservation, Christian and Brooks continues to be influential in advancing equity and promoting sustainable practices for a better world. Thank you, Christian, for being with us today. And we are excited to hear your presentation to talk about these issues related to extreme heat. I'll turn it over to you, Christian.
Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate it. So I have a short presentation for you all today, and this presentation, I'm going to lay the foundation for what we're going to be talking about today in terms of extreme heat and why it is very important that this is something that we pay attention to. We start to advocate for legislation to affect change when it comes to this issue. So if we can move over to the next slide. Okay, first, so let's start with what is extreme heat exactly. So, extreme heat is characterized by temperatures and humidity higher than average for a specific period of time, typically about 2 to 3 days. And extreme heat varies based on season and location. So, a lot of the times when we are thinking about extreme heat, we are thinking about places like Arizona or Florida, Georgia, Texas, when they have temperatures that are well into the hundreds. However, extreme heat can happen anywhere, and it can happen during any time of the year. So right now I'm in DC. Many of us are in the DMV area. So if it is February and we have a week of days where it's 75 degrees or 80 degrees, right? We'll be outside. It's great. However, that is still considered extreme heat because it is abnormally hot for that time of year for this location, which is the DMV area. And it can have a profound impact on the environment in terms of insects, plants, as well as animals. Now, what causes extreme heat is high concentrations of heat trapping gases. Which increase atmospheric temperatures. And this results from activities that use fossil fuels, such as operating vehicles, power plants, or mass farming. Next slide. So, extreme heat can be very dangerous. And I'm talking about the extreme heat where we are experiencing temperatures in the 90s to well into the hundreds in areas that don't typically get that hot. Um, so, extreme heat can impair the body's ability to regulate its internal temperatures. It can lead to heat related illnesses such as heat exhaustion, dehydration, heat stroke, heat cramps, and more. But extreme heat can also have an impact on pre-existing conditions. So respiratory issues as well as cardiovascular issues can be affected by extreme heat. And typically during the summer months, when you are in areas that typically get really hot, there is a higher percentage of hospitalization for respiratory issues as well as cardiovascular issues. Next slide, please. So, when it comes to people who are at a higher risk of being affected by extreme heat, we have pregnant women, the elderly, children, low income individuals, and people of color. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus on low income individuals and persons of color. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about the urban heat island effect for a second. So, urban heat islands are urban areas that are hotter than neighboring suburban and rural areas. And this is typically because urban areas have higher concentrations of man made surfaces such as buildings, asphalt that will absorb and emit heat, making the surrounding temperature hotter. But then we also have those activities that cause those heat trapping greenhouse gases in urban areas, such as there are a lot of vehicles in urban areas. There are power plants, and there are power plants in urban areas that will have those heat trapping gases, emit those heat trapping gases as well. And then there's less greenery to cool the air within urban areas. Now, urban areas can be between 1.8 to 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than rural areas during the day, and up to 22 degrees Fahrenheit warmer at night. And that's because, as I mentioned before, urban areas have man made surfaces such as asphalt and buildings that will absorb heat during the day. And at night, that heat gets emitted back into the air. It doesn't just go away, it gets emitted back into the air, making the surrounding temperature hotter in those areas. Next slide. So within urban areas, there are intra-urban heat islands. And intra-urban heat islands are when you have neighborhoods or areas within a city that are hotter or have a higher heat island intensity than other areas within that same city. And these are typically low income communities and communities of color. So, a recent study found that in most major cities, neighborhoods with higher populations or higher concentrations of people of color experience higher heat island intensity than parts of the city with mostly white residents, regardless of income. And we'll get into that in a minute. Next slide, please. And that is due to systemic racism. So there is a strong correlation between areas impacted by redlining and areas that have a higher urban heat island intensity. And this is due to one, discrimination within urban planning. So there was a study that found that between 2001 and 2011, predominantly white areas saw an increase in green spaces, whereas greenery in mostly neighborhoods of color decreased. But then also we talked about how you have those plants that emit heat trapping gases. Well, those are typically located in low income communities of color. And when we think about highways and things of that sort that typically are built in urban areas, those are located in low income communities of color as well, emitting heat. Now, because of this, Black and Hispanic residents have the highest and second highest average exposure to urban heat islands, respectively. And this increased exposure to extreme heat has led to higher heat-related illnesses and deaths amongst Black and brown people. Next slide. So this is a case study that I am going to kind of dive into a little bit where we can see some of this stuff actually happening. And this was the Midwest heat wave of 1995. So the Midwest heat wave of 1995 was one of the most severe heat waves in US history. It lasted for 5 days and had a heat index that reached 126 degrees Fahrenheit. It affected cities like St. Louis and Chicago. Chicago was the most affected city where over 700 people died. And many of those people were elderly, low-income individuals and people of color for the same reasons that we just talked about in terms of systemic racism, having that higher heat island intensity in neighborhoods of color and low-income neighborhoods. Next slide, please. Okay, so I am going to stop here because I know that this question, what can we do about this, we will go into later on in the discussion. So I'll hand it back over to you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Christian, for setting the foundation for this important topic and really delving into the impacts that it has, especially on Black and Brown populations. And so we're going to turn it over now to Dr. Jackson, who is a graduate of Louisiana Tech University, where he earned a bachelor's degree in business management. In 2016, Dr. Jackson earned a Master of Divinity from United Theological Seminary of Dayton, Ohio. In 2022, Dr. Jackson successfully completed a PhD program at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Policy at Southern University, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He also completed studies at Texas A&M University, Indiana University, and Harvard. Dr. Jackson is also former chairman of the Shreveport City Council and former two-term chairman of the Metropolitan Planning Commission for Shreveport and Caddo Parish, Louisiana. Dr. Jackson was employed by the Southern University system as a special assistant to the Chancellor for Institutional Advancement and University Relations for over 11 years. He has been a board member of Habitat for Humanity in Northwest Louisiana, Shreveport Chamber of Commerce, Shreveport chapter of the NAACP, YMCA, and the Louisiana State Fair. As a native of Lake Charles, Louisiana, Dr. Jackson is the pastor of Morning Star Missionary Baptist Church. Dr. Jackson is the former pastor of Mount Olive Baptist Church in Greenwood, Louisiana, as well as the former president of the 13th District Baptist Association's Congress for Christian Education. Currently, Dr. Jackson is serving as vice moderator at large at the 13th District Baptist Association and Northwest Regional Vice President of Louisiana Missionary Baptist State Convention. Dr. Jackson also initiated numerous ministries to minister to health, education, and financial welfare of the community. From 2014 to 2018, Dr. Jackson served as the 18th president of the Baptist Ministers Fellowship for Shreveport, Bossier City, and vicinity. His leadership tenure for of the more than 90-year-old organization was highlighted by the unmatched fact that Dr. Jackson served directly after and directly before two icons of the local civil rights movement who were also national leaders within the faith community. On October 5th, 2002, he was elected to the Shreveport City Council as the representative for District G. As councilman, Dr. Jackson served as the city of Shreveport's Youth City Council. And in the summer of 2006, he created 100 jobs for young people in the city. Dr. Jackson also completed a term as a member of the board of directors of the National Black Caucus of local elected officials. Married to Rhonda Williams, Dr. and Mrs. Jackson have two children, Christian and Cameron. Dr. Jackson has been the featured speaker for churches, graduations, corporate meetings and government agency meetings, law enforcement training conferences, women's conferences, college and university events, and military base events. Dr. Jackson has served as host of Black Talk Radio, KYSB AM Power after years, KOKA 980 AM, and other shows, and host In the Spotlight with Theron Jackson, Facebook Live, and is the author of Never Be Nothing. Dr. Jackson is one of the instrumental leaders with Together Louisiana, a network of 250 congregations and civic organizations working together to improve the state's quality of life. In December of 2018, Dr. Jackson was appointed by Adrian Perkins, mayor-elect of Shreveport, as a member of the transition team. Dr. Jackson was appointed by Governor-elect J.B. Edwards in 2005 as a member of the transition team. Subsequently, Dr. Jackson was appointed by Governor J.B. Edwards to the Louisiana COVID-19 Equity Task Force in 2020. In November of 2022, Dr. Jackson was appointed by the mayor-elect to be part of the transition team as well. Dr. Jackson served as the president of the Shreveport Minority Business Council, as Pole March of the Bossier City chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity, and vice president and coach with the West Shreveport Little League. He served as a junior achievement consultant at several area elementary and middle schools. He also has served as Cub Master and Scout Master in an effort to promote and sustain urban scouting. A graduate of both Leadership Shreveport and Bossier and Leadership Louisiana, Dr. Jackson is also a former member of the boards of the Sci-Port Discovery Center and the Caddo Council on Aging. Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to you now to talk about your experience around these issues of extreme heat.
Thank you so much. And first, my apologies for whoever sent that bio. I'm sorry you had to endure that, but thank you so much. It's my privilege to be engaged in this work today with each of you, and I appreciate the presentation that we just received from Christian as well. And so she helped to cut my introduction down, at least the part I want to say significantly, because in extreme heat in urban communities, which we like to affectionately refer to as the hood, where we are, there are, in fact, as she said, lots of things that impact us, and climate change exacerbates that issue for us. And it's particularly severe in the densely populated places like where we are right now. And not only are we densely populated, but we are under-resourced as a community. And so the problem is also, and she mentioned some of it, driven by what we like to refer to as these heat trapping materials, concrete and asphalt, which is what our communities are largely made of. And we don't have the kind of tree cover, nor do we have those kind of cooling bodies of water that other folks may have in their community. We become these asphalt and concrete jungles, for lack of a better description. And with that, the health impacts we've discovered have become severe. She talked about heat strokes, but the cardiovascular and respiratory issues, and just increased mortality we found around this increasing. And just to put it in layman's term, every summer seems to be getting hotter and hotter, and the winters are shorter and shorter. And so we're dealing with these realities. And as you know, these also exacerbate socioeconomic issues, because where I am, the cost of air conditioning can be so out of reach for many low income people. There's still local entities who are having fan drives. And I don't have to tell you that fans don't get it done for senior citizens or anybody else for the most part in the kind of oppressive heat that we deal with from day to day. And so with those kind of energy demands and during heat waves, not just in this area, but other areas, I know there have been some rolling blackouts and other things like that that impact our people. So the question for us was, what are we doing? And I'm glad to say that we are doing 3 or 4 things that I'll say, and then we can talk about it later. One is community education and advocacy, where we're involved in serving as a center for community life in general. And so as a result of that, we have a role, we believe, to educate people about the dangers of extreme heat and ways to stay safe. And not just to talk about it, but we also secondly provide cooling centers, right? Our cooling center, we had a storm that came through and knocked out a lot of electricity, and it exacerbated our ability to be a cooling center, and we had to turn for about 2 days into a 24-hour shelter, quite frankly, for folks. But fortunately, because we're already doing that kind of work, we're prepared to do that. And that's also helped to inform us, as we were already in the process of building infrastructure. We have just right down the street from our church, what we consider greening initiatives. We're planting trees, planting fruit trees, planting a garden, doing other things that will increase the green space in our community. And then I will also say that we are educating around the notion of energy efficiency and renewable energy. We are becoming one of our area's first 2 lighthouses. In our lighthouse project, we are becoming what we consider to be an alternative to the energy that has consistently or persistently or historically been the single source. And so for us, we are in about a $500,000 project now to install solar panels and a backup battery that will allow us to be a lighthouse, so that when the community is hit with a storm, and I might add, as I advocated to different bodies, elected officials and political bodies, in a request for resources to build this out, one of the things that I consistently say to them is that while in the southern part of our state, folks know us for having hurricanes and different kinds of storms, and we're not as much in Northwest Louisiana known for hurricanes and those kind of storms. But I work in a community where there are storms every day that have nothing to do with wind and rain, that because of financial storms, people's lights are out right now today, not because of wind or power, but because they don't have the ability to pay electric bills that are skyrocketing in the summer. So we're trying to make sure that we become the kind of space that people can understand they can turn to. And so we're working with installing solar panels and starting to try to educate our people around the notion of being able to get to a lighthouse when you need that kind of help. And then I think one of the more important things that we're also doing is building partnerships. When I talk about building partnerships, there are groups around the country. We're blessed to be associated with the group that's called Green the Church. And in the Green the Church movement, they have been finding ways to make this conversation that is relatively foreign to many people who share the space that we do in many urban communities that are faith-based, who don't have this conversation, so don't have the language to begin to talk about those things that are very important, as it is our responsibility as folks who consider ourselves people of faith to take care of the world that God has given us. And so as a result, we feel incumbent to start to do many of these works. And so when I talk to people about what can we do, one of the things I suggest is that there are other organizations who have a whole lot more skin in the game, who have a lot more intelligence around this information, that rather than trying to recreate the wheel, we ought to be partnering with folks who are doing what they're doing. We hold our space. We know our people. We know that we can be information centers. We don't know it all, but we can connect with people who do know, so that we can provide that information for our people. And so, in our nonprofit at our church, we have been working with the National Institutes of Health. For the last 3 years, we've been working with Annie Casey Foundation for the last year and a half, and we've been doing things to bring in resources because our people sorely need it, and we can't work to recreate wheels that are already rolling and already turning. We just want to plug into those things that are happening and make this beneficial to our people. And so as a leader, even among pastors, I try to say to organizations and institutions who seek to reach our people that very often, yes, the church can be a place, but it is not the panacea for all change just because it exists in a community. It has to have the kind of mindset and the heart for people who live in that community beyond what can be extracted from the community. You have to have a group of people whose heart is what can we give to this community and how do we stay plugged into this community so that we have a sense that if our church disappeared tomorrow, our community would be in trouble because we want to be just that important to the folks who live in that community. So I will say it's not as easy as just dropping off pamphlets and saying something or being critical, quite frankly, that what many pastors and church leaders lack is the language to be able to talk about important issues like this, because they don't find this in normal Sunday school lessons and the same in the vacation Bible school lessons. Somebody needs to talk about these things that are important to our people. And very often, yes, no doubt it should be the leaders, but very often they lack the language. And so I want to say thank you to those of you who are doing this work in this space to try to make in my case, the Black church more bilingual, right? Be able to talk more than just faith, be able to talk more than just a Bible, be able to talk more than just theology, but to talk survival for our people, because I believe that's the reason that the Black church was born in America, and we can't lose either our identity nor our responsibility to continue to stay in this space and hold the hands of our people up, doing whatever it is that we can do. So thank you so much for this opportunity to participate in this conversation. It's tough work, but people respect and appreciate the fact that if you do nothing more but open your doors when the air conditioner is on, you help them by being a cooling center. So I just would encourage people to just take these first steps to doing so much good work. Thank you so much for this time as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, for your firsthand experience about the amazing work that you all are doing. I'm going to turn it over now to Ava Richardson, who is the Director of Sustainability with the City of Baltimore. Ava has over a decade of experience leading public health initiatives, advocating for environmental policies, and managing programs designed to address social and racial inequities and environmental justice. She previously served as the sustainability manager and a Food Matters technical advisor in the office, where she led the implementation of special projects, supported the Commission on Sustainability, and helped to pilot new sustainability programming, such as the farmers market-based food scrap collection pilot. During her time with the city, Ava also served as the Recast project director at the Baltimore City Health Department, advancing efforts to address decades of trauma in West Baltimore. She holds a BS in biology from Frostburg State University and MPH from Morgan State University, and is currently obtaining a doctorate of public health with a focus on environmental health and engineering from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Thank you, Ava, and I'm looking forward to hearing your words from your expertise.
Thank you so much, Karen, and good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure and an opportunity to speak to you all this afternoon, especially following Dr. Jackson and Dr. Brooks. I really appreciated both of your talks and comments. I really want to just highlight something that Dr. Jackson said in terms of I'm kind of like the messengers, and I think you said it really eloquently in that faith-based institutions are incredible staples in our community, and we partner, as the City of Baltimore, we partner with faith-based institutions on a lot of different climate issues, and we have quite a few that actually serve as resiliency hubs across our city, and some of them may even serve as cooling centers. So it was great to hear that point, but definitely, I think there's so many different types of stakeholders we can be collaborating together to complement each other's knowledge base and expertise, in really ensuring that together we are working to provide residents with information services and a degree of climate resilience, especially as it relates to extreme heat. So to just kind of provide a high level overview of some of the heat related programming and efforts that we have across the city of Baltimore. We do have a Code Red extreme heat program, and that really focuses primarily on the acute response to heat. So that particular program determines how extreme heat code red days are issued, which is driven by the Baltimore City Health Commissioner. So typically a combination of heat index, temperatures, and other factors will determine whether or not a heat advisory or a code red day is established, and that triggers the opening of cooling centers across the city. And as I mentioned, our cooling centers are various partners across the community that range from different community sites, libraries, community centers. Some are faith-based institutions, as well as other buildings and spaces that can be leveraged for that purpose. That process and during that heat season that goes from May to September, and during those months, we're also tracking any heat-related deaths that we see across the city and figuring out how we better respond to challenges that people are encountering. That is very different from heat mitigation, which is what we're doing to actually cool communities. And I have to be very transparent in saying that in terms of what it looks like to more proactively cool communities, to support the integration of cooling or green amenities at the community level, that takes much longer. And it's not something that we've always had the ability to put a lot of time and investment in. And we're still trying to figure out how best to strategize around those, around that issue, planning for a hotter and warmer climate across our city. Based on some research, Baltimore City can have the third highest increase or incline in urban heat globally, among cities globally. And so we also know that by 2080, we could potentially have the same climate as Jackson, Mississippi. So we know the climate across our city is going to be changing. Even within the past week, we had some code red days that were issued in September, which is relatively late for us. And so all of that being said, I wanted to talk a little bit more about what it is that we mean when we say heat mitigation. And I think Drs. Jackson and Brooks spoke really well to kind of like some of the things that can be done on a hot day when people are experiencing challenges. But I wanted to speak to some of the data and strategic planning that we're considering for mitigating future extreme heat challenges that Baltimore and other cities are going to be facing. So to start, I just kind of want to frame things around like what we know about. So we, as was highlighted, there's a lot of health risk associated with hotter temperatures. Not only are there heat-related illnesses, but other illnesses can also be exacerbated. Having pre-existing conditions can be made worse when it is really hot outside. You also have a lot of people who are encountering occupational challenges. You have children playing outside. In many ways, heat can intersect or overlap with air quality issues as well, depending on the amount of ozone in the air, depending on the amount of particulate matter in the air. And this summer, for those of you that live in this region, we had a code purple day as it related to air quality. And I do just want to make a clarification there. Code red days, again, are focused on a combination of heat index as well as air temperatures. But when we talk about like code purple or code red days as they relate to air quality, that is based on a different measurement system. It leverages a network of monitors that are measuring different types of pollutants in the air. Typically, there's 6 criteria air pollutants that the CDC regulates, and those include PM 2.5 and 10, as well as ozone, lead, and others. So, but we know those things can be interrelated. And so how we're planning for that. So part of the challenge is like having adequate data to really inform what it is that we're talking about and what we're looking at. So we do have some aerial analysis that really makes it very clear that certain parts of the city, certain communities are hotter than others. And we know that in formerly redlined communities, often divested communities or lower resource communities that oftentimes have a higher proportion of people who either identify who are minoritized or essentially a part of the global majority, but a higher concentration of people who are minoritized. Those parts of the city actually end up having being hotter. And part of that is because of a combination of having a lack of environmental amenities, having a lot of concrete and asphalt, and oftentimes, the use of even cooling approaches such as air conditioning can also put strain on the system, which Dr. Brooks spoke to as well. So where we see some critical gaps in that data, because we do get mortality statistics on heat-related deaths, but sometimes you can see like 1 or 2 deaths in a season. And in many ways, that's a reflection of a very sophisticated heat response, acute heat response. But we're not getting a really good sense of other individuals that may be having heat-related health events, whether or not that's real. We're talking about kind of like emergency room visits, or better understanding if there were other causes of death that were attributed to other chronic conditions that were exacerbated by heat. And that's really hard to know. That's really hard to understand. It takes a level of analysis and data that we just haven't been able to conduct yet. And there's often like data security or kind of like data privacy issues that come up, especially when you're talking about ED visits and mortality data. So that's something that we want to better understand who is encountering severe challenges as it relates to heat. We know when surveying community residents across Baltimore City for our climate action plan, the number one climate issue that people raised was extreme heat. A lot of people raising feeling really hot and uncomfortable when walking outside of their community, expressing some challenges and navigating the outdoors during those times. And we also know that there is a correlation between heat and other human behaviors that we want to be really cognizant of, but we don't have the local data or analysis yet to do that. So that's one gap we really need to bridge in terms of the heat kind of like just better understanding the public health outcome or the public health impacts of extreme heat. We also know, kind of based on previous research, the types of interventions that help to cool communities. We know trees are the best and most important way to cool the community. Trees are, they're kind of magic, right? They provide shade, they provide evapotranspiration where we get more moisture in the air and have a cooling effect on communities. And trees also provide other environmental benefits and connect people to nature, green the communities, and have correlations to other beneficial social outcomes. Many streets, unfortunately, due to either the way that street is designed, may not have the design to have trees planted, or there may be a need to pull up concrete and asphalt in order to plant trees. And in some cases, or in many cases, planting a new tree that's been there for a couple of years, it's not the same effect as trees that have been in a community for 30 years that provide a magnitude of difference when it comes to the environmental benefits, especially from a heating perspective. So how can we provide some of the benefits of trees while we're waiting for those trees to reach the level where we know that they're providing us those environmental amenities that so many communities want and deserve? So we can be looking at installing other types of shade structures, right? That's one of the benefits trees provide. How can we incorporate other shading, whether or not that is temporary shade structures, or if that's looking at getting really creative with how we're doing it. There's some shade sales that can be incorporated. A lot of these things have permitting and like different regulations that have to be complied with if you're going to put in any type of temporary structure. But it's something to think about, something that we're looking into. How can we incorporate more shade in communities? It can be something as simple as like a pergola, or something more complex where we're supporting kind of like more semi-permanent structures that provide shade in certain areas. We can support cool surfaces. These cool surfaces can range from asphalt to cool roofs, to other types of materials or cool materials that don't absorb and retain as much heat. So there are reflective paints that are intended to go on asphalt, and asphalt typically, because it's darker, will absorb more heat during the day. And the most dangerous kind of like point, oftentimes during a very long heat wave, is at night, because that heat from the concrete and asphalt, it gets released. And so if we can avoid that absorption of heat during the day, so that where people are not facing that challenge at night, we could potentially help people be more comfortable in their homes and in their communities. We can also support the installation of cool roofs. And there are some projects, some research projects that are taking place right now to support that. And that has the added benefit of not just cooling a community, but cooling households as well. Definitely individual households can incorporate air conditioning and fans and do cooling at the individual household level, if you can afford it, because it can be very expensive. There's a lot of cost burdens as it is associated with that. So as local governments, as arbiters of social good, in protecting the public's health, we have to think about that community scale and what that looks like. So cool roofs, definitely. And that can be a range of, that can range from different types of white roofs to green roofs, etc. And then other types of greening. So we mentioned trees, and that's one critical piece of vegetation that is so important for cooling. But there's other types of vegetation that could potentially be incorporated at the community level to support that some of the same benefits as trees. You won't get it at the same level, but you can support some of those same benefits. And there's also blue-green infrastructure. When we talk about how we incorporate more water in the environment, some places you may have seen some restaurants, they'll have misting systems. You may have a fan that's blowing a little water on you while you're eating outside at a restaurant on a really hot day to help to cool folks down. So those are some of the kind of like community level cooling approaches that we are thinking about and looking at, but are still, one of the challenges with this work, I think, is like having the resources dedicated, because heat mitigation in many ways is a topic or subject that doesn't always sit neatly into one particular area, because a lot of it is related to infrastructure, and that can fall under a Department of Transportation. But there's major public health implications. There's also major climate and sustainability implications. And so figuring out and leveraging all the investments that we have going into community to determine how we leverage those investments to also cool communities, particularly those communities that, again, lack those environmental amenities. And again, thinking of those amenities as some of the things I just mentioned, ranging from from trees to cooler surfaces, greening, and etc. And then there's this also added benefit, or there's this opportunity to kind of exploit co-benefits, right? Because we can have ways to incorporate shade using solar canopies that also provide us an opportunity to generate renewable energy. So there's, I think, ways to create and foster poly solutions or solve multiple problems as we're integrating this type of these green amenities or cooling infrastructure into communities. And there's a potential benefit for placemaking as well, especially as we're greening communities. Depending on what that final design looks like, it can be a great community building activity and opportunity, in a way to make people just feel more ownership over their community and feel more connected to it, when there has been investments into neighborhood aesthetics and beautification that can have a lot of other social benefits that maybe we haven't even thought of yet. But we are thinking about all those things, and I hope that in the future, in the future, we're planning to develop a heat mitigation plan, a comprehensive heat mitigation plan for the city, which would focus on specific communities in detail and outline different types of interventions that would go in at the community level and measure that impact in a pre-post process. So working with the Baltimore Social Environmental Collaborative, which is a grant that was awarded to several institutions across the region, including Johns Hopkins University and Morgan State University, we'll be starting some focus groups to better understand from community members some of their challenges dealing with heat. And we're also working on bridging the data gaps or the gaps in analysis that we currently have to answer the questions that we have, and looking at some pilots for incorporating things like reflective paint or other ways to be really creative and look for those poly solutions, those solutions that address several different issues at a time, and figuring out how do we best deploy equipment to measure the impact of those efforts. So thank you again for having me speak, and happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Thank you so much. So thank you to everyone for just giving us your expertise for this session. We're now going to transition over to a collective dialogue with our speakers right now. If you have any questions for those who are watching, please put your question in the comments section and we will get to it. I've already seen one question that we've gotten so far, so we will get to it after we go through some of these initial conversations. And so talking with you all, can you tell us about a bit about some of the work that you're currently doing, and what are some lessons learned and best practices that others should know, particularly kind of standing from where you are either as a policy expert, as a city official, as a pastor, speaking from your position, what are some of the lessons learned and best practices that others should know when trying to protect populations that are more susceptible to extreme heat within the communities that we serve? And feel free for anyone to jump in.
Well, I'll start just by saying something that I have to acknowledge. I don't think we've always been like great at being proactive about, but I think part of it is like really thinking about the most vulnerable populations, and oftentimes that is elderly individuals and those with disabilities, especially people who may have a higher chance of being socially isolated, and making sure that during those days there is some kind of like checkup on folks who we know that are older, living in homes without air conditioning or without a lot of resources to cool. And also having that data, because again, if we know that our data is showing us that certain occupations are also people that support certain occupations that work outside or outdoors, if we know that people working in those occupations are experiencing more heat-related illnesses, then we need to do targeted outreach and engagement, and have some practices change so that there's some real intentionality around like how we can actually make sure that employers are aware of how to work with their employees and their workforce to protect them especially during those extreme heat days.
I also say that you mentioned at the policy level, I think that many local, or let's just say people in our community, we have to get more engaged in advocacy at the local level and understand what we mean by policy, so that these, whether they be commissioners or city councilmen, folks who serve at these levels, understand things like heat resilient building codes, particularly for communities that have been traditionally communities of color. I've worked in zoning and been on the zoning commission as a chair a couple of times, and even as a city council person, to understand that many people who are elected in our communities are still being elected because they're the most popular, because they've been elected a long time. They understand absolutely nothing about policy making. They understand politics and glad handing, and they look like me, right? But they don't necessarily understand policy. Unfortunately, we don't live in a place where we have prerequisites that folks ought to have some level of intelligence before they become elected officials. And some of our elected officials subvert that responsibility of service for royalty, unfortunately, and don't get the notion that they have to continue to understand policy. So I think it behooves us as communities to collaborate with each other, to stay organized and become group advocates together. Because the one thing many of those folks still understand is political pressure from groups of folks. And so we have to be willing to fight, but fight around issues that really matter. And a part of it is informing people why they ought to be advocating it. We'd be surprised that a lot of folks will probably be on board with us as we advocate around issues like resiliency in our communities and things like the policy that I'm talking about. Again, heat resilient policies, that when folks have if you're going to do new construction in these communities, cool roofs and cool pavements. What do we do? What's on the agenda for cool pavements for our community? We know we're not going to get any trees like Ms. Richardson was talking about, perhaps overnight, obviously, but what about cool roofs? And what about cool pavements? Just things that are going to allow us to subsist until such time that we can, that we're able to green ourselves more sufficiently, right? And so I just think that you don't hear this kind of conversation having in too many spaces. We act like the only thing that matters in our community, and not that they don't, but they can't. We cannot only talk about police brutality, and we got folks dying in our community every day when the police don't even show up in areas when we have these kind of things happening. So I just think we have to make sure our repertoire is not as narrow when it comes to advocacy, and begin to add things that matter in sustaining our lives as well.
Yeah.
So I will say that when it comes to issues of like extreme heat, just climate change in general, I think it's very important that we continue to look at these issues from an intersectional lens. And we've done a really good job of that on this call, but I have been in many spaces where the issues of climate change or environmental justice is kind of seen like one track minded. But when we kind of evaluate what we've been talking on this call so far, we've talked about climate change, we have talked about environmental justice, because not having adequate green space in your neighborhood is an environmental justice issue. We've talked about economic injustice. We have talked about housing. We've talked about infrastructure. We've talked about workers' rights. All of these things are intersecting to create this issue and the impact that it's having on low-income folks and people of color. And it's extremely important that if we are going to come up with a solution, it has to be a multi-layered solution, because the issue is multi-layered. And that is kind of what I talk to organizations about in my my consulting work. But I know, Karen, we have talked about this many times. This space of environment and climate justice tends to be very, very white. And the detailed conversation that we are having right now, where we're getting to the nitty gritty of issues, it's not happening. So we have to make sure that when we're talking about this issue, we are going past the surface level. We're going deeper. We're hitting root causes, and we're looking at the multiple things that are affecting people and the multiple things that are making the issue what it is.
Yeah, thank you all for bringing up such important points around the need for just more representation, to make sure that there's other lenses that are being brought forth to the conversation. So my next question for you is, there's so many federal programs such as NOAA's National Integrated Heat Health Information System, the U.S. Global Change Research Program for the National Climate Assessment, and the EPA's Heat Island Reduction Program, and the Department of Energy's Weatherization Assistance Program, that provide resources, information, and strategy to promote resilience and adaptation at various levels of government and within communities. Can you speak about, one, do you feel like communities are aware of these programs? And also, have you been able to even build these or share and resource and put and incorporate these programs into the work that you're doing?
So in many instances, for us, for example, there are at the EPA, and I want to say at Department of Energy, a couple of different places that work on the state level as well as on the local level. Most recently, we've been involved in trying to create and build resilience hubs and around our state. So we kind of become more aware of these things because of the that was the Inflation Reduction Act. I think it was is where all the resources have come for this kind of green infrastructure. And so we are learning more about it, but it's not as if it's as widespread. We don't know as much as it as we do about it as we do about HUD, as we do about all these other programs that have been so traditional for communities like ours, I should say. So it's, again, some taboo conversations. It's a strange space, and everybody still seems to be competing in a smaller space for limited resources, not being knowledgeable of the fact that this is happening. I will also say many of these things are also happening as community, as block grants to states and to communities. And so if we're not engaged at that level of conversation, very often they're not directly being granted to organizations at the level that many of us may also operate at. So some do have the availability to do that, but I think it is important. Collaboration, I just can't, if you're just interested in something, just know that there's somebody out there who is doing something, and you got to be willing to collaborate with other people. So again, Green the Church and other people who are in these spaces can really be helpful, because many of these grants, as I think Brooke Christian was saying, it's multiple layers. Well, it's layers to all of this stuff, right? And it's levels to all of this stuff. And very often it's happening at levels that sometimes our nonprofits can't access. But through collaboration, we can become a conduit for some of these things as well. So I think it's very important to check with your local cities and find out what they're doing. You know, the city of Baltimore, the state of Maryland, people like that may be already competing for the money that's in these buckets, in these agencies. And so you have to be connected with those groups as well. So I think it's important to collaborate and to educate yourself in these particular types of spaces.
Christian or Ava, do either one of you want to add?
Yeah, Karen, could you just repeat kind of the last part of the question, please?
Oh, yes. Have you found that looking at some of the federal resources and programs that have happened, have you been able to incorporate it into your work or even resource other communities with it, as well as do you think communities even know about many of the programs available that address extreme heat related issues?
Yeah, it is a good question. I think a lot of the supports are kind of spread over different types of funding and different agencies, and so definitely we've been looking at the NOAA resilience funding and put in like a for that particular pot of funding, and have been monitoring other federal funding opportunities that relate to transportation infrastructure, like the Protect grant, and are trying to think about like how do we incorporate these requests into some of these large federal funding proposals. But yeah, I think as far as I have seen, and if anyone on the call knows differently, please correct me. But I think a lot of the federal funding is often attached to other broader programming or initiatives, and I haven't explicitly seen funding specifically for heat mitigation or cooling. It seems like it has to be. And to the point made, it's important that we integrate like our heat mitigation approaches with other climate mitigation and adaptation approaches. That's really important. But I think as a topic, the field is having to fight for funding that isn't necessarily dedicated for this purpose, and so that is a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, and I would say that I have been able to partner with organizations like Creation Justice Ministries to disseminate information on extreme heat, what it is, what are some things that you can do to mitigate, what are some ways that the faith community can respond. But overall, I don't think that the information or the funding is getting to people at the grassroots level in the way that it needs to. When it comes to the federal government, there tends to be a information bottleneck to where if you know, you know, and if you don't, you don't. And if you can get to the funds, you can get to them. If you can't, you can't. I'm not sure what can be done about that, but yeah, I definitely think that the information needs to be more broadly disseminated so that more people can have access to it. And as was being said with the funding, as Dr. Richardson has said, it's typically attached to something else rather than it just being a standalone, okay, this is an issue and here is funding to do something about this issue.
Yes, thank you. So I want to turn it over now to one of our audience questions from Stephanie Willett. The question was, how do you recommend that churches expand their reach? Many have created community development corporations so they can get funding from non-traditional sources. Many haven't. And then tax exempt statute concerns. And so thinking about the question in a broad sense, how do you recommend that churches expand their reach when it comes to doing this work?
I think simply as a first step, you could in fact establish a 501c3 separate from the church if you have those other kind of concerns that you just spoke to. I think that more importantly, it's just getting busy doing the work. I mean, just getting out there doing the work. The level of tax status and all those things, trust me, it's an important conversation, but it certainly needs to be the caboose and not the engine. Because very often what happens is people will be engaged in what I call mission creep, right? Because it's not in their heart. That's not something they have the infrastructure, the capacity of people to do. They just heard it was $50 downtown you could get if you do X, Y, Z. And so they moving over here to do this. And that's not a heart for that. I think you've got to make sure that the church has a heart for serving the community, and it will be led by that heart to do those things that matter and put itself in those spaces where it matters. There'll be a lot of challenges. And I got to tell you, that if your church is serious about it, I mean, it's great that there may be resources out there that you could access, but pardon my vernacular and my grammar, but if you ain't willing to put your own skin in the game, quite frankly, your heart ain't there yet, right? And so if it's only an interest based on some money that happens to be out there or something we heard about, then I've come to learn that, that's probably not our space. We got to be led by where our heart is. And so sometimes we want to do things differently, and some strings that are attached to different resources won't allow us to be authentically who we are. Well, if we believe what we believe, then there's resources larger than those that exist. And so I think I would just say, I'm certainly not suggesting that you should jettison the notion of structure and do things in those ways, but that should not be an impediment to getting started, right? If you don't know what to do fully, connect, collaborate, and just do something. Put yourself in the way, make yourself available, and allow people to come. There's some churches who don't want folks to come in their building. They got new spaces and new furniture, and people can't come. So you got to be careful and be sure that when you get in this space, you got to know it's kind of messy, but it's what we call to. In our opinion, that's what we've been called to, and we don't get to peek in our neighbor's window before we love them, right? And so at the end of the day, we got to be willing to just do those things. So I would certainly not suggest that you don't look to get the structure, and you can get people perhaps in your congregation who can assist you with the formalization of that structure, but you got to be led by your heart and get in the middle of this. Even if you don't have the structure, you don't need a grant. You need to put your money where your mouth is, and if you're not willing to do that, then I just think it may not be time to get into this space.
I would also say that it's important to be willing to, as Dr. Jackson said, collaborate with other entities within your community that are doing this work and might already have those structures set up. So there are other churches that do extreme heat, climate, and environmental justice advocacy. There are nonprofits within your area, also government agencies. So be willing to do some research and reach out to see if y'all can get some type of partnership going. I know that when I was doing research on extreme heat, there was a church that was actually able to set up as a cooling station because they partnered with a local governmental agency, the agency for, I think, aging, and they were able to get the necessary funds that they needed to open up as a cooling station. And that cooling station not only served as a cooling station for the elderly in the area, but also people who were housing insecure, children, all of that. So be willing to kind of step out of the box and not try to reinvent the wheel, because if there's somebody that's already doing it great, then why not come alongside them?
I just have to say, I agree with both of those statements. Definitely partnering, collaborating with other stakeholders as much as possible. I think is so critical that faith-based organizations are working with other organizations, and agree working with local governments or nonprofits is really important. And then I think also, yes, to the extent that you can leverage the space that that church owns or the faith-based entity owns for that purpose, thinking about whatever that looks like, whether it's weatherizing or cooling the facility, serving as a cooling center, or looking at how your parking lot can have more shade, or there can be more impervious surfaces surrounding the building. I think there's a lot of green infrastructure and a lot of other cooling design ideas that can be brought to church facilities in general as a way to demonstrate that for community, and hopefully encourage other faith-based partners to do the same.
May I add to? I think we have to be real cognizant of the fact, and in this, and I've experienced this over the course of the last 5 to 8 years, that we have to be sure that we're not adding to the problem. Okay, that's a big piece of this. That very often we have visions of grandeur and larger buildings and things like this, and we're in the middle of urban communities. Very often, the largest building, and when we go into a building project, we build these larger structures. We build these larger structures, and we take up all of this green space that's now concrete. We got runoff that now our communities begin to flood more because we're there. We got to figure out that we will not. And what we have done is decided that based on our ownership of property and where we own property, that whenever we take something away, we got to give something back, right? And so the extent to which we're able to erect anything, we're going to have to demolish something somewhere else and give some earth back, because if we're not careful, we can be, in particularly Black communities, a large purveyor of that same problem, and we're adding to it and not conscious about how we assure that we seek to try to make sure we're in the mitigating business and not just calling it kingdom building with all of this concrete, right?
Yes, thank you all for your responses. And thank you, Dr. Jackson, for reminding us that we need to be in the mitigating business and not just in the adaptation business. And so making sure that we're not adding to the problem. Now, one of the things that Ava mentioned was the issue of extreme heat, and how Baltimore, like many other cities in the coming decades, are slated to be much warmer. I think you said it would be a temperature related to like the climate of Jackson, Mississippi, if I recall correctly. And so knowing that much of our heat is going to move up further north than what we see in the deep south, the southeast part of the US in particular, knowing that it's going to happen, I also think about what does that mean for our church spaces. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about how should churches, knowing that the heat situation is only going to get worse without proper mitigation, how should churches be rethinking our spaces? We've mentioned before, like cooling stations and other places, but how should we rethink the building as well as the resilience programs that will also need to be expanded or even started at some churches?
Well, let me just say that I think you hit the nail right on the head, that we got to begin to continue to, well, we got to begin to educate, and in some cases continue to educate around this need. And so if there is a new building process, there is a new building project. And I got to tell you that I think the pandemic has put a new perspective on a whole lot of things, right? The extent to which folks are expanding at all, right? I think what we really have to consider is, what about existing spaces? How can we take the existing spaces where we all, notwithstanding whether we're in the deep south or the northeast or the DMV corridor, wherever we may be, and start to say, as we look at rethinking our space, let's reimagine what this space looks like. That doesn't mean there won't be building projects. There may be renovation projects, rebuilding projects that have a healthy outdoor space, a healthy green space, but doesn't jettison the reality that people will also need shelter. People also are increasingly, unfortunately, homeless. And so what are our campuses looking like, and how do we show that we have an appreciation for the reality that there is, unfortunately, an increasing homelessness that is encroaching upon all of our communities, and then we still need to be able to be people who can get fresh food and fresh water ourselves, and our campus is able to become purveyors of that, and more importantly, teachers of the folks in our community how to be sustainable, how to, in fact, be more resilient themselves. Not just the church, but how can we start talking about solar panels at your house, in our community, in our block? Not our church be resilient, but our community become more resilient.
Anyone want to add to that? Okay. One of my other questions that I have is, Ava, well, actually, all of you at some point have talked about the need for partnership. I'm wondering if you can speak to the benefits as to why more secular, whether it be government, NGOs, and others, partner more with faith-based houses of worship. And so, what are the benefits to being able to have relationship with the houses of worship in the various communities?
Yeah, I think for many faith-based institutions and churches, I mean, they are trusted messengers in many ways. Faith-based leaders are oftentimes looked up to and just trusted to provide advice and direction to parishioners that really informs on various aspects of how people can improve their quality of life. And so I think having that message come from faith-based leaders or faith-based institutions is really critical and important. And it's also a great way to, again, for churches to lead, or for faith-based institutions to lead in such a way that demonstrates how some of these goals can be accomplished by leveraging the space that the places of worship occupy. I think also faith-based institutions are there's a huge benefit in kind of like a multi-faith kind of collaborative, where you can address or unpack some cultural nuances or subjective norms that may be ingrained in communities, and kind of like unpack them and address like why things can or should or need to change. And so I think it's a great place to have like difficult conversations, especially when it comes to like whether or not, or how climate issues are impacting us directly. And when we think about like who are the most competent like climate communicators, or who are the best climate communicators, I often think it's not the experts when communicating with communities, because sometimes crafting a message in such a way that relates to people's the challenges that we're all encountering in our everyday lives is I think faith-based leaders are really, really good at communicating messages in such a way that really resonates with parishioners, and they know the community. They know the congregations, and really have a really good sense of the challenges that people are facing, and can really help in crafting more messages that stick and resonate more.
Yeah, I would echo everything that Dr. Richardson said, but I would also like to add that faith-based spaces tend to be very diverse, even if they are homogenous racially. And what I mean when I say that is you can go to a church and you will have a CEO of a company, you will have somebody who is a student, you will have somebody who, I don't know, works at McDonald's, you'll have somebody who is a seminary student, all in one space. And being able to give information to those people so then they can then go and give that information to their respective communities is extremely powerful. Faith-based spaces have a huge reach just by who is in the room and who is connected to whom. So I think it is extremely important that government agencies as well as nonprofits continue to partner with faith-based spaces for all of the reasons that Dr. Richardson has also named, but also because of the diverse reach that these faith-based spaces have.
Yes, thank you so much to all of you. This concludes our session. I will say I just shared a link for Creation Justice Ministries Heat and Health resource, which is designed and also written by Christian, to actually be a resource to help churches to understand what is the problem of extreme heat and how to also respond. This resource also includes various things such as bulletins, virtual bulletins, as well as printed ones that people can use to even give simple tips, even as simple as how to know if you're in danger of a heat-related illness, and being able to share that easily with people in your congregation can even just make a difference. And so thank you so much to you all for this session. I hope this has been a very fruitful experience for those who have been able to watch. And again, the resources in the comments section, and I hope that you can take this back to your local community, as well as be able to do some advocacy in the future for such an important issue. Thank you, everyone. Have a good session for the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.